So, welcome everybody. Today it's just to let you know that the Trees and Design Action Group is a network and a forum that brings people and organizations together to support the role of urban trees through better collaboration in the planning, design, construction, management, and maintenance of our urban places. And we always like to point out that evidence-based information is really important to us. So we always hope that we present you with information for which there is a strong sort of evidence-based backing. Now, for this year's seminars, our theme is trees as critical urban infrastructure. So this is really the first kickoff one on that basis. And when we were trying to think what we should call this sort of group that had loosely got together, the choice was the Trees and Design Action Group. And I've always felt that we sometimes lose sight of the design element. So that's the reason for today's session, which is Designing with Trees Part 1, Above Ground Ambitions. I also want to thank our knowledge sharing partners for partnering us with us on this event, who they have a really vital role. They help to disseminate information, to their membership. It doesn't mean they're financial sponsors, they're knowledge partners. So today we're partnered with the Chartered Institution of Highways and Transportation, the Institute of Highway Engineers, the Landscape Institute, and the Urban Design Group. So now I want to introduce our chair for today, Saira Ali, team leader for landscape design and conservation at Bradford Council and president-elect of the Landscape Institute, for which I'm sure we all want to give many congratulations. So Saira, over to you.
Thank you, Sue. So I'm a landscape architect here in Bradford, and my work focuses on delivering greener, healthier places through landscape-led regeneration, climate resilience, and blue-green infrastructure. And we now have a strong and growing evidence base demonstrating that urban trees deliver environmental, social, and economic value, from cooling our cities and managing water surfaces to improving air quality and biodiversity and mental well-being. And the debate is no longer whether trees matter. The real issue is how well are we designing with them? Because trees are living infrastructure, and like all infrastructure, they require space, coordination, technical understanding, and real long-term stewardship. So in practice, we often see the same challenges: pressure from utilities, highway requirements, lighting, development, viability and maintenance constraints. And too often trees are treated as afterthoughts, fitted into residential spaces, and we then wonder why they struggle to survive. But if we're serious about delivering climate resilience, healthier streets and nature recovery, we've got to learn to integrate trees from the outset. And that means retaining existing mature trees wherever possible, selecting the right species for the right places, designing proper soil volumes, and working collaboratively across different disciplines early on in those processes. And today's speakers reflect that shared responsibility, from tree selection to lighting, urban design, planting programs. And this is exactly the kind of cross-sector conversations that we need to have. So from my perspective, long-term success with urban trees really depends less on individual techniques and fixes and more on that collaborative leadership, aligning our profession around those shared outcomes. If we design together from day one, trees will flourish. If we work in silos, they won't. I'm really looking forward to today's discussion and to exploring how we can better embed trees as part of our critical urban infrastructure for the future. So without any delay, can I introduce Harry Watkins, who's a landscape architect and director of the St Andrews Botanical Garden in Scotland, who will talk about tree selection and what is the right place and what is the right tree. Over to you, Harry.
Thank you for having me, Sarah. Thank you for having me, everyone. I'm just in the process of sharing my screen, which I think is in the process of being enabled. But just in case there's an issue bringing that up, I wonder if you could start us up with the first slide, because it looks like there's an issue with the sharing at the moment. There we go. There we go. So the question that I wanted to bring to the group this afternoon is to think about this phrase that we're told all the time: right tree for the right place. And I've approached this phrase with trepidation for quite a long time, because it feels quite dogmatic. It feels quite specific and prescriptive. And increasingly, as we look at our research into tree physiology and performance, in particular in stressful conditions, it seems that there is no such thing as the right tree or the right place. It feels like there is this spectrum of possibility. And so that's, in a way, the premise for this talk, is to think about what information do we have? How can we make better decisions? What kind of resources do we need in order to make those decisions? And the talk being called Thesauruses, not encyclopedias, is really a proposition, which is to say that most of our information comes from these huge, heavy tombs, which are very specific, which almost always end up with a plant requiring free draining, free draining soil with good moisture. And to think about thesauruses, which are more about synonyms and more about like alternatives and how we can think about variation in the urban landscape. So in terms of where we are today, I wanted to start with thinking about some of the big existential challenges we're faced with when it comes to tree selection. We know that climate change is presenting unique risks. We know that these risks are complex as well. And what I wanted to do is approach this question of complexity and challenges from some of the infrastructure and systems that we have to deal with them. So thinking in particular about the development and construction industries, thinking about how we set ourselves up to meet these challenges. So my proposition here is that these issues are systemic, they're connected. And in a way, what I wanted to do is look at some of the kind of things which we see happen on a day-to-day basis. I want to tackle them head on. And in saying this, I don't want to kind of suggest that everything's doom and everything's gloom. There's lots and lots of good stuff happening, and there's lots of really good initiatives being delivered at the moment, and there's a lot of enthusiasm and energy. But unless we get to grips with these challenges, that energy and enthusiasm is going to find it a real struggle to get ahead. So when I think about those challenges, I think about routinely on sites, we see plants being delivered that weren't specified or being delivered in different formats. We know that substitutions to contracts are made, sometimes without the knowledge of the client or the specifier. And we know underpinning this as well that our workflows that we use to design are rooted in a 20th century perspective, even though there's all this technological development happening at the moment, which is super exciting. There's this big lag. So in looking at these challenges, I wanted to share a couple of pieces of research and then look at what we can do about it. So the first challenge to look at comes out of what was kind of addressed in a way through a piece of research that we did for Scottish Government a couple of years ago now, which is to look at this gap that I think we all know exists between what's specified and what turns up on site and what's actually planted. And Scottish Government were interested in the biosecurity implications of this. And what we did is we looked at what I guess the cumulative picture looks like for development in Scotland. And we went through the planning portals and we extracted lots and lots of projects that were part of green infrastructure schemes, major developments. And we extracted from them all of the specifications, so in terms of the plants, the sizes, the formats that they should be planted in, their arrangements. And then we compared those plants to what was planted on site. And I think in a way, this wouldn't be a surprise to anyone in this meeting to know about this, but I think this is the first time that numbers have actually been put to this. We compared what's on the ground with what's in the specification. And we found that less than a quarter of schemes are actually delivered in compliance with the permitted approved scheme. So this is a huge problem. It's a huge blind spot. It means that when policymakers go to things like international conferences like the COP, which is about to happen, it feels that policymakers very often don't actually know what they're getting when they try and pull these big policy levers. When it plays out on the ground, it's so easy, I think, for professionals, for local authorities to look at the projects and kind of treat each one on a case-by-case basis and miss a cumulative picture. And what we see when we put all these things together is a major problem, I think, for our industry. So we see plants being poorly maintained, we see variations to contract, we see areas of planting that are very different to what's being proposed. In one scheme, we saw one of the most extreme examples. We saw what was meant to be an avenue of oak trees on a housing development being actually planted as a series of Formium Tanax, New Zealand flax. So there's this huge gap between what's expected and what's delivered, but these gaps play out for reasons. These reasons are to do with supply chains, they're to do with knowledge bases. And we can see this in the contracts that we have. Very often the project team changes as the planning permission is granted. We know that there are challenges because there isn't like a contractual relationship between, say, a designer and the contractor very often. It's managed through a project manager, a QS, or a contractor. So these changing relationships need thinking about. Second challenge I wanted to draw attention to is to do with species selection. And that's really the subject of the talk today. But we know that getting it wrong or not doing it in a way that's optimal leads to limited ability to deal with some big climate questions we've got to do with biosecurity, the provision of ecosystem services. Some of these are tangible, some of them are less tangible. But again, this cumulative picture is what I'm interested in here. And when we went through the specifications that have been drawn up for these large green infrastructure projects, we added together all of the plants that were being specified and grouped them into different types of plants, hedges, trees, shrub and herbaceous plants. And we found in particular, when you look at trees, we're particularly vulnerable in terms of an exposure to risk here. The idea that, 3 or 4 tree species there make up the lion's share of 50% of all specified trees across Scotland is a hugely worrying situation. And we know that, if you have a question about drought tolerance, especially in urban environments, Vega sylvatica is probably not your answer. So we're doing something wrong here, and we need to address that. Looking at why this comes about, though, is an interesting question. And we did some research for DEFRA a couple of years ago, which looked at where people get information from. We asked landscape architects, urban foresters, designers, contractors, nursery people, what are you using when you make decisions, when you give people advice? In a way, it's not a surprise to see industry guidance and nursery catalogues as top of the list. It's quite encouraging in lots of ways. For people like me who work in academia, it's a pretty existential and worrying finding there that our research struggles to make it through. And when it comes to design software, I was particularly interested in this because a lot of our decisions are almost made sometimes by default. We might not want to admit it, but the softwares that we have, like Revit and Vectorworks, they include libraries for plants. And it's very easy to draw on a palette of plants baked into that. And the question here is, what's the quality of this information that we're using? Is it the right information? When we look at this situation and think about how does it come about, how are we spending our time? Well, our time is spent because someone pays us to do it. We have clients who instruct us to design schemes, manage projects, that kind of thing. And we asked part of this research for the government a few years ago, how are you spending your time? And it was interesting to see that, again, the lion's share of people's time is being spent on planning the project, getting the outline permission, and it seems that there's this big drop-off. As soon as planning permission is being granted, even if it's a case of then having to discharge conditions or whatever, it seems that there's a drop-off in the nature and the duration of the engagements of the professionals in projects. Perhaps if that's the case, it's not such a wonder that we are faced with the challenges that we have. If the people responsible for designing schemes and seeing them through to implementation aren't being instructed to do that, then we've got a problem. And we perhaps need to think about our relationships, our contractual relationships, and the terms under which we're appointed when we start to try and address these problems. And the third little graph here I want to share with you is the question that we asked the same people. What do you look for when you're choosing a plant? And it's encouraging to see that ecosystem services are right at the top of the list. People are thinking about provenance and stress tolerance. People are thinking about biosecurity. What people aren't so interested in about, things like the quality of the plant there, down the bottom, the supplied size of the plant, is in a way frustrating, but at the same time perhaps understandable. If you've got consultants who aren't going all the way through the scheme, all the way through the contract, and being there on site to make sure that they're delivering the scheme properly, maybe we shouldn't be surprised. So these things are interesting to reflect on and see what people value. The question that leads us to, though, is, are you able to actually make that decision? If you're looking for that information to make the choice that you want to make, is that information out there for you? The challenge then is to think about our design workflows. Now, these are rooted in CAD, and there's been this long-standing ambition to make BIM part of our workflow and to become more familiar with that. again, I think the trouble here is a knowledge gap. It's knowledge in the right format when it comes to BIM, because it is incredibly frustrating and time-consuming and difficult to produce product data template, PDT, for any given plant that you're using in a project. Nonetheless, it's a huge opportunity, and that's where we see a lot of potential. At this point, I wanted to kind of stop thinking about the challenges and start thinking about how we address them, and to introduce the idea of plant strategies. So plants, trees, take the forms they have, they live the way they do, they have the morphologies and physiologies they do for evolutionary reasons. This process of adaptation, interaction with other organisms, natural selection, means that there are strategies that plants have to take in order to survive and reproduce. Starting to think about trees as strategies rather than as things is a hugely exciting way of dealing with some of this probability and complexity. And when it comes to dealing with that complexity, what's interesting is that a lot of our resources, a lot of our knowledge base, because we're humans, we get distracted by the tinsel. We look at the extremes very often. We tend to focus on plants which are particularly vulnerable to drought. Many of the willow species, for example. I think trees that are particularly drought tolerant. I think Kentucky coffee tree, for example. We tend to focus on those extremes. What we don't understand that well, I would suggest, is what's in the middle, which is frankly where most plants, trees actually are. If you look at this graph here, for example, which has a normal distribution, bell-shaped curve, 70% of the organisms within this bell-shaped curve is a huge amount of variation, and it's something that we don't understand well. Our research group tried getting to grips with this a few years ago, and we looked at how you can reconcile some of these ideas of plant strategies with urban design questions. And on the left-hand side of this graph here, what you can see is a trade-off graph in the yellowish kind of color, where you might see different organisms suited to different kind of life strategies. Position A being a fast-growing tree that isn't very stress-tolerant. Position C there being very stress-tolerant but not very quick-growing. Then E and D being kind of strategies which are kind of pushing the envelope a little bit but running up against buffers. So where strategy E gets into trouble is where it can't keep up because the turnover is, or the conditions are so challenging that growth isn't possible within the time frame that the plant has got. And likewise, at the bottom corner there, the growth is inefficient unless there's a lot of reproduction going on from an evolutionary perspective. We try to map that kind of picture of strategies, trading off between speed of growth and metabolic pace against stress tolerance. We try to map that onto the urban terrain and think about, like, if we've got these plants with different strategies, where might we either find them, where might we be best at planting them? And it's quite a nice little trade-off there. It's a nice little kind of like mapping exercise. You can kind of intuitively kind of see how this might work in a brownfield site where there's a lot of disturbance, there's a lot of variation and heterogeneity in the environment. You might see that suiting quite ruderal species, fast-growing species. Other end of the picture, bottom right-hand corner, we design a lot of podiums, car parks, streets where there's a lot of reflected heat, drought, soil compaction, all those kinds of things. Those would suit, the more stress-tolerant plants. And then where the living is easy, as it were, where there's lots of resources and things like parks, swales, that kind of thing, that's where you would typically be best suited to grow the more competitive plants. That makes sense. The top right-hand corner is, in a way, like the worst of all possible worlds. Trees aren't well suited to that environment, so we kind of recognize that that's not something that we can easily manage. And what I wanted to introduce at this point is this idea that there is this huge amount of complexity for us to manage and deal with, but that this is a fantastic resource for us to work with. And it shouldn't be this kind of, in a way, like a race to the bottom. This complexity is something that we should revel in and really use to our advantage. So in terms of how we can use it to our advantage, last year our research group published this paper. I think it's open access, so you can get it fairly readily. If you can't get it or are struggling to access it, just drop us a line afterwards and I can send you a PDF. But I think this is one of the largest, if not the largest, collections of data screening in trees and shrubs for urban environments that's been done for Northern Europe, at least. And if you go to the back of this paper, you'll get all the data and all the tables, but the paper itself might be worth reading to give you a sense of like what these plant strategies mean, how you can understand them and apply them in an urban terrain. And what we did in this exercise was to go to some really well represented collections of plants in Arboreta, Botanic gardens, and look at the plants growing there and see how they perform. And it's interesting to see, you can see there the dots, different coloured, the red dots being the shrubs, the kind of, well, I'm colourblind, but to me it looks kind of turquoisey teal kind of colour. You can see those are the trees, and you can see again intuitively they're occupying different spaces of trait space. And what this graph, this triangle shows us is that some plants in the bottom right hand corner are most stress tolerant, and as you kind of go up the graph, you're getting quicker growing plants. You're getting plants which are going to establish more readily in the urban environment. When you went to the left, then you're looking at more more shrubs, and you're looking at plants that are able to occupy a wider range of environments. So this picture is interesting, perhaps. In this paper, that you can see just here, you've got a lot of data, you've got a lot of information which now we can take into design projects. And I wanted to really start to end this session here by thinking about the ways and the means. So it's very easy to think about the means that we have for specification, so that's the information, the knowledge base, the conversations, these kinds of meetings. And we can definitely do more about that. Meetings like this break down those barriers and are hugely helpful. The ways are knottier and they're more difficult. We take a lot of them for granted. They're deeply baked into our systems. So I think that's where there's perhaps a bigger challenge, but still progress that can be made. Wanted to think about those ways in a way that might be optimistic and feel about a can-do approach to it, and think about how we would set up like a gold standard for specification. Now, this isn't the first time anyone's said that out loud. There's a lot of work which has been done on this over the last years, but I really want to start bringing this to a head now and thinking again and freshly about specification. We've done a lot of work on biosecurity risks in our group. We've done a lot of work on physiology. We know that substitutions happen on every project. We might as well get real to it and alive to it and start structuring our knowledge and our information and our specifications so that if we're sending trees to a site, we know that there are going to be challenges with the contractual relationships or whatever. Say it's a quantity surveyor managing a project, giving them the means to make acceptable variations to contracts so they're not swapping out a Quercus robur for Formium tenax and thinking it's green, it's got roots, it'll do. We need to framework to think about like what possibility really looks like so that we can quickly decide if there's a challenge in a supply chain and if a nursery can't get something to the site in the right way, how can we make the right alternative decision at the right time? So in terms of next steps, we're doing a lot of work with Scottish Government. We've done some work on Woodland Trust for biodiversity, thinking about natives and non-natives, how we can reconcile some of this stuff in that framework. We're doing work for the University of St Andrews about specifying plants all the way from the nursery, creating the bin materials to get them into site so they can go on to be managed, growing the trees here in the Botanic Garden. There's a lot of work that we're piloting here, but what we'd be really interested in doing is coming together with industry and thinking like, where's the consensus, where's the interest, and making some changes and looking at how we can best bring those to and think about what the training and skills development packages are that we need in order to make this happen. So at that point, I'll finish my talk here and hand over to the group. And if there are any questions, then we can pick those up later on too. Thank you.
Thank you, Harry. Yeah, it's about having the right training, isn't it, and the skills to make the right decisions at the right time. Are there any urgent questions for Harry that anybody wants to put across? If not, I can go to the next presenter.
Somebody did have, well, something was raised which we might just get out of the way, which is Harry. It was felt you didn't mention the.
I can't hear you. I don't know if anybody else has that issue.
Can you hear me? No?
I can hear you, Sue.
Yes. Yeah. Okay, I'll carry on. It was sort of, oh, good. Show of thumbs, good. So, Harry, it was several people raised the fact they didn't think you had raised the profile of the arboricultural expert sufficiently. Can you add them to your?
Absolutely. The arboricultural experts are a critical part of this. just looking through the questions, was that it was to do with, it's the question here with kind of like, where's the tree expert, the consulting arborist? So the consulting arborist, the tree experts are part of this group of specifiers. So they could be urban foresters, designers, landscape architects. There are many ways of being an expert in trees. I guess for the, just making it a short turn of phrase, I kind of like summarize that. But no, the consulting arborists play a critical role in this. I wouldn't want that to be missed out, or I wouldn't want there to be any doubt about the expertise that dendrologists, arborists have in this.
And Naomi's got her hand up.
Yes, thank you. Sorry, my camera's not working. But in your schematics, there doesn't seem to be a consulting arb or an arborist involved. In addition, one of your statements was that although there are specifications that address some of the issues and the challenges, those specifications are not ending up in the ground. And so, in my experience as a consulting arb, if there isn't a presence on site during the activity, the stuff doesn't happen. It requires a presence and oversight of the people with the expertise on how each of these elements are implemented in order to make them happen. And if that isn't a requirement, then we have what we have. Thank you.
I'd agree, Naomi. Like, that's one of the findings of the research. We know that there are big problems in our contractual relationships, in the delivery of trees to site. And I guess what this research is showing is that very often these experts aren't part of the discussion, or they come in at later or earlier stages. And what we want to do, I think, is think about, like, why is that the case? It's not out of bad will or people forgetting. It's because the people who very often commission this work are under intense pressure to deliver schemes. They've got budget constraints, time constraints, whatever. And they're very often looking at, like, what's the quickest way I can, or the cheapest way I can get a tree into the ground. And until we start making it the case that people do pay for consultants to get onto site and oversee the planting and all that kind of thing, then yeah, we have that problem. The number of people that we spoke to as part of this research who say, like, I was part of a design team from outline planning through to detail and discharge of conditions, and then I wasn't part of the site project anymore. It's staggering. But the number of people who then went on to say, oh yeah, but I went along after work to go and see the planting, or I went along at the weekend to see the trees in the ground. It was amazing. So a lot of the people in our profession, they're not being there because they don't care or because they're not interested. They are passionate, and the fact they're going in their spare time when they're not being paid to go there is in a way testament to that. And I think that's the thing where we've got this huge opportunity. We've got the enthusiasm, the motivation, the expertise very often. We need to get the contracts in place and make sure that people are being paid to get there.
Thank you, Harry. So if I can introduce our next presenter, Lorraine Calcott, Director and Principal Designer at It Does Lighting Ltd, who will talk about lighting for trees, nature and safety.
Oh, I'm just going to share my screen, bear with me. That one, there we go. So thank you, Sarah, that's very nice of you and nice introduction. Very happy to be here amongst the tree people. I would like to say that I am a great fan of trees, so I'm not here to tell you that lighting should win that engagement. I've got two companies, so I'm a lighting consultant, but also a light and health specialist. And I'd certainly believe that trees form part of the latter and are incredibly important for delivery of health in all aspects. So let's get into where trees and lighting are together. So bear with me while I just do that. My slides are not changing. There we go. Right, so trees are literally an essential part of the infrared delivery.
Lorraine, we haven't got them online. It's not shared yet. No.
I'm sorry, I thought I had. Apologies. Right, where would it? I thought it had shared it. Has that done it?
It's starting to come. Yeah,
Right.
got it.
Apologies. Right. Start again. So trees are literally the most essential part of an infrared delivery system, and and they are a rare and valuable thing in the universe. If you actually look to other planets that we know of in the known universe, there are no other trees out there. So there might be diamonds and gold and other rarities out in the universe, but there are no other trees that we know of. So an incredibly rare thing, and we should be cherishing them. They provide a huge amount of infrared light along with any plants and planting. And the picture that you can see to the right here, that is an infrared picture of a landscape. So that's not snow that you see. That is actually the glowing infrared light that is being picked up by the camera. And as you can see, that is, an incredible amount of energy that is coming from the trees. There is a lot of aspects of infrared light equipment that is being promoted out in the internet these days. And the best way to get infrared light therapy is to actually go and sit with nature and be amongst the plants and the trees. Mitochondrial health for human beings relies entirely on infrared light for its motility and cell health. And being underneath unregulated blue LED light actually is reducing cell activity and resulting in early cell death for human cells. So we actually need to be out in nature, and we need to be exposing ourselves to trees and their infinite infrared light that they give off. So trees protect us from the blue end of the spectrum, and they give off far more infrared, even more than directly from the sun. So that's how powerful they are. So again, really important in our infrastructure and in our developments. So treat yourselves, to every day to get outside in some daylight. Now it's not sunlight that you necessarily need. That's more for the vitamin D production. But getting out in daylight, sitting under a tree with your breakfast or your lunch, etc., is an incredible way to get yourself healthy. So years ago, and not that many years ago, heliotherapy was used in abundance in hospitals. You can see this lovely image here where they used to roll the beds out during the day and expose people to daylight. And this actually resulted in, incredible health benefits, etc. And we are moving slightly back towards that as we begin to do such a lot more research where we're bringing in that knowledge again about what actual daylight does for us. And that isn't just the visible daylight, that is also the invisible daylight where things like infrared, etc., are most evident. So 30 minutes minimum of daylight exposure a day, I would suggest. And most people, you probably don't realise this, but 90% of the population in the UK spend less than 30 minutes outdoors. And of course, in the winter, a lot of that time is actually spent outdoors in darkness, going to and from work, etc. So try and make sure that you get your 30 minutes minimum of daylight exposure. And ideally, try and do that around 2 hours after sunrise, because the mitochondria, which is in the back of the eye, which is the majority of the mitochondrial intensity within the body, it responds best to light coming in at that angle of where the sun is around 2 hours after sunrise. And bear in mind that those people who perhaps go into hospital, so if you're ever unfortunate enough to be in hospital, try and ask for a bed near a window, because you're likely to recover at least 3 to 4 days faster than those at the other end of the ward. So it's incredibly important to expose ourselves to light. And trees and natural light should always be a priority in design. And certainly I am not here to tell you otherwise. The trees are vital, no question at all, but human safety and a sense of place is equally as important. And those things come from a combination of trees and light. It can't be just the trees or just the lighting. And of course, that safety element, especially with vulnerable people at night times, we want to make sure that everyone is happy to leave their home and to go out at night time and are not confined to the insides of their houses. as you can see from this picture here, we've got a column here and trees set nice and widely apart. And the reason for that, this is a project that I delivered in Rochester, is that these trees, obviously, as you guys know, will grow into quite large, big, huge trees with large canopies. And from a lighting point of view, I need to be able to deliver a lighting column at least 5 meters from the edge of the fully grown canopy. Now, that's something that doesn't seem to always be understood, and it's the only way that I would be able to get local authority approval for a design is if we have those kinds of spacings. And also, I like to think that the light needs to have what I like to think of as a visibility splay. So if you're looking at the light, we need to make sure that the light is coming out of the column and it is delivering the light to where it needs to on the street and the pavement. If trees are too close, of course, that means that we're not meeting the standards, but also we're getting the light being blocked. And that's not useful for that feeling of safety, etc. And the right placement of trees and lighting improves the outcome for both parties. So in this little video, just have a look and have a think about how this makes you feel as we go down the street. Now, the lighting's all in a perfectly good location. It's set back at the back of the path. We've got quite a clear road and a little bit of planting. And at the end of the road, you can see that the column here is set back and set forward rather of the larger trees, etc. So no impinging from the trees here. But what we have got is a few little young trees that might grow up later on to become a little bit bigger, but nothing that's going to impact the highway. But from my point of view, I would suggest that it is, it's a little bit bland. It feels a little bit too concrete and pavements, and not necessarily a particularly nice space to be in. Now, in a few years, when that planting has grown, that may be different. But at the outset, we're not seeing a great integration there between trees and lighting. So some of the challenges that a lighting designer faces are often probably some of the challenges that tree people face, in the sense that there is only limited amounts of space within the infrastructure and within a layout for a housing development where we can actually put trees or lighting. And I've found certainly in the last few years that has become a smaller and smaller space that we are allowed to be putting anything. And there appears to be some kind of standard designing process for housing developments that just doesn't factor in where we might put a lighting column or a tree to make that space feel a little nicer. And trees on building lines, for instance, here we've got a tree. I would very much like to be putting a lighting column there, because either side of this we have parking bays, so I certainly can't be putting them there. And I need to be within 0.8 meters of the carriageway. I also need to be 0.8 meters either side of this location here to any area where there might be traffic. So parking bays are included in that. So what often happens is we get a tiny slither of land to pop something in, but actually we don't have the clearances. So if you are designing layouts, then certainly a 1.8 meter gap is desirable for me to be able to put that in with safety and compliance to the standards. So layouts aren't being designed with those things in mind, and coordination early with trees and with the rest of the layout team. And much as Harry has said, it's not unusual for us to come in at an early stage and do some preliminary lighting design, and then we'll get to the end of the job and nobody's updated that, and they're still working on something that was only at prelim design, and then wonder why it won't get approval with the street lighting teams in the local authorities. So much like yourselves, I do suffer from being excluded at key points within the design process. So one of my favourite slides, we are spot the lighting column. It is in there somewhere, and obviously this is not ideal. Trees grow, and as we all know, during the course of the early doors of a development, we might find that trees are cut back and maintained, but as time goes on, that doesn't happen, and then we end up with the tree enveloping the lighting column. And the creatures, bats, ecology, etc., are not benefiting from a nice environment because they've got a light stuck in the middle of it. And we also find that in the winter, the trees don't always lose their leaves around the light because they're confused by the time of the year and the time of the day often as well. So nobody wins in this situation, and I certainly want to be in a position to avoid that by communication. So some of the challenges I might find on a lighting layout or a layout to try and include lighting is, you may not know, but I need to be able to put lighting on a bend, for instance. It can't go on the inside edge, it's not allowed, so it has to go on the outside edge. We can't overcome long lines of parking bays with only little slithers of land in between because, as I've said, can't put a column there, not enough clearance. We also might want a header column, but here we've got loads of parking and again, a tiny slither of land. We've got areas here where we've got columns very close to the front of buildings because we no longer have front gardens on developments, and that gives an issue with obtrusive light into windows. And then we've got even a cul-de-sac here that is right on a bend. So where I want to put a column here, I can't. And of course, we've got rows of trees. They might be sitting behind the lighting column, but what they're doing is they're still going to impinge that over time. So we would need to remove those and relocate them somewhere else. And here on the bend, again, another tree has gone in. So, you know, we've also got all these existing very large trees, which in this case had a high ecology department and in ecology component rather, not department. And that means that we aren't able to locate columns very close to that either. So there's lots of areas on this design that were challenging, and certainly the layout is not great because of that. So here we can see a design which has got a lot more trees on it. For instance, this was again actually Rochester Riverside, and we've got header columns in there for this road here. We've got a header column there, and we've got sort of a header column there. But these trees that are located next to this particular one, they would need to come out because again, we want that visibility splay of light coming out to the sides. And what you might notice is the columns are in the verge where the trees are, because we cannot put them behind them. We have to have them either level with them or in front of the tree line, and the trees need to be that distance apart again. So there isn't always a lot of options, and I need to have them spaced at somewhere between 28 and 42 meters. Generally, we don't go wider than that, and we don't like to go any less than that. So there is a few restrictions, and of course we still want to be able to get in as many trees as possible. The reason that we used to have a lot more flexibility was we used to use SOX or SON or metal halide lighting with very little optical control, and we'd end up with this very bright space, light all the way up the trees, light all the way over this side of the road as well onto the chimneys, and all the way up the bank, etc. Nice warm orange light, not I would prefer that we got back to a warmer color temperature for sure. But then when we look at the LED version, where even though we've gone to higher columns here, we've actually got a very sharp cutoff, and that actually determines where we the reasons that we have issues in locating columns with LED lighting these days, because we don't have the flexibility or the bleed off that we used to have from this style of lighting. And here you can see you've got nothing on the tree, you've got nothing on the chimney pots, and this is incredibly dark. So great for ecology and great for restricting the light, but not necessarily going to give you the flexibility in design. So where we place trees is obviously very important, and this tree, etc., are way too close to this column or probably any of the trees on this side of the road. So that is something that that we need to be mindful of. And then it's not just roads where trees and lighting intersect. Obviously, there's many areas within a development, certainly in the larger ones. And where we've got a piazza style layout, we've got lots of trees, which is great. It's what makes the space interesting. We've got some lit benches and some post top mounted columns. What we also have in here is some tree uplighters, and whilst the ecologists might feel uncomfortable with putting light into trees, and on many respects I agree with them, where we are trying to provide some form of vertical illuminance to make the space feel more open and more desirable and safer at night, certainly from a crime and community safety point of view, then we might want to add a little bit of light. But I do feel like often the use of uplighters is overused and they're far too bright, and we end up with too much light in the tree. So placement and lumen intensity is key. So there's a lot to go through with lighting and trees, but for now, I'd like to thank you for your attention, and I am happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Lorraine.
No problem. I've got to figure out how to stop sharing now.
So are there any urgent questions? I think I saw one from Sasha Curran, and she said, are there references available to support individual follow-ups and research?
Is there what? Sorry, Sarah, I didn't.
Are there references available to support individual follow-up and research? I think that was...
Follow-up and research to which particular bit?
Oh, it was your references at the beginning about what lighting does for us, the health impacts of lighting.
Much research, yes, tons of it, mostly from the likes of Dr. Robert Fosby, Dr. Glenn Jeffries, Dr. Alistair Nunn. I mean, the Guy Foundation, etc., are doing a lot around this, and they're really into the infrared space and, how we are beginning to need to see that end of the spectrum, which is massively missing from LED lighting currently, and wasn't missing from so many of the light sources that we used to use. So it's been a double-edged sword. We save a load of energy, but we've also provided a light source that is inferior in quality and not particularly helpful to us or nature. Are there any?
I did see something, Sarah. Shall I just ask it? So much has been going on, but somebody was saying that in Copenhagen they string lights between the buildings so that maybe they're more central. I don't know. The Copenhagen person, put your hand up, but are they positioned differently so these visibility displays are less in conflict?
Yeah, catenary lighting used to be quite used to be used a reasonable amount of time quite a few years back, probably when I started in lighting about 30 or 40 years ago. And we've moved away from that for various reasons. A lot of the time, catenary lighting tends to swing around due to the sag of the supply to it. And with wider and wider streets that we're getting now in some of these developments, that it becomes untenable to do. But it's still an option to explore, but it isn't necessarily something that is favoured by local authorities now, and therefore tends to mean that we can't use it.
The last thing I spotted was we're all very exercised about lighting being in conflict with biodiversity. And that was for the trees, but also everything else that's kind of got its nightlife going in the natural world.
So we would certainly be wanting to look at warm colour temperatures, where we're removing a lot of the blue end of the spectrum, which is the most activating for ecology. And we would want to probably think about lowering light levels. And there is a new British standard being written at the moment, which I'm part of, that for street lighting, that is going to look at other methods of lighting that isn't just street lighting, to try and reduce the impact on ecology and nature. But with LEDs, as you could see from that one of those slides, we are looking to, LEDs do contain the light a lot more than they used to, except we do still have quite a large proportion that are using the whiter light sources still, which I think we need to move away from to protect nature. So.
Thank you, Lorraine.
No
if there's no other questions right now, there'll be an opportunity at the end to ask more. I'm going to introduce you to the next presenter, who's Christopher Martin, co-founder of Managing and Director and Head of Design at Urban Movement, who's going to talk about trees in urban design.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. I'm co-founder and managing director at Urban Movement. We're a public realm and transport design practice, kind of focused on bringing together an interdisciplinary team to improve sort of urban moments where everyday life needs transport. So we spend our time designing streets and public spaces, as well as developing movement and place strategies and thinking about new streets, spaces, and transport systems as part of development planning processes. What I am not is a landscape architect, which I think is exactly why I've been invited here amongst so many expert landscape architects. I spend most of my time thinking about how cities work, why some streets are alive and others feel empty, why some invite walking and conversation, while others simply invite traffic. What this kind of exercise has offered up is something quite curious, that one of the most powerful pieces of urban infrastructure isn't concrete, isn't steel or AI, it's a tree. A single tree can slow down cars, can shade pedestrians, can mark a crossing, create a meeting place, can host birds, support business, and give a child somewhere to climb all at the same time. So trees are not decoration, they are systems infrastructure. The question isn't simply should we plant trees, in my mind, and I'm sure yours, it's how the trees shape the behavior and life of streets. So trees are systems infrastructure. If we are to understand this, we need to understand that we exist in and design within a system. So we need to be systems thinkers if we're going to succeed. Systems thinking understands that situations are interconnected wholes rather than isolated parts. It's about understanding the relationships, interactions, and interdependencies within a system to identify the root causes of problems and develop right solutions. And essentially, when we pull at the thread and change the natural order, there are connected consequences. Here's a real illustration of systems thinking. In the 1950s, the Dayak people of Borneo here experienced a malaria outbreak. So they called the World Health Organization, and the WHO responded by spraying the island with DDT, which successfully killed the malaria-carrying mosquitoes. However, it also led to the sudden collapsing of the island's thatched roofs. Turns out that the DDT also killed off a parasite that kept the population of caterpillars in check. The caterpillars, free from the parasites, rapidly multiplied and also ate their way through their chosen diet, thatch. So the WHO replaced roofs with tin. Raining a lot in Borneo, this proved to be incredibly distressing. The sound of the rain on tin, making the homes completely unlivable. At the same time, the DDT also wriggled its way into the food chain, from the DDT-resistant bugs into geckos, which were the diet of choice for the island's cats. The cats couldn't tolerate the increasingly concentrated DDT in their bellies and all began to die. They reduced in numbers so far, but they were unable to keep the rat population in check again. And this then resulted in Borneo's rat population multiplying unhindered, eating their way through all the food and grain supplies, and finally introducing the plague. So in desperation, Borneo once more turned to the WHO, whose only solution to attempt to restore equilibrium was to parachute in cats. True story. And why is this relevant? It's because human beings are walking animals. This is fact. You look at our pelvis shape, our foot structure, vertebrae, tendons, and like loads of fossil evidence. We are evolutionarily adapted for bipedal walking, and the evidence is overwhelming across multiple scientific disciplines. Our natural habitat, our natural system is to live in sociable, walkable places. But let me tell you, we've really pulled a thread of that natural system for sure. We've created places that make walking impossible. And we've created human habitats where our natural system is disregarded, ignored, and discouraged, making walking impossible, unattractive, or untenable. So pulling at this thread and disrupting this system has serious consequences. Cities globally are experiencing unprecedented levels of obesity, diabetes, stress, anxiety, loneliness, premature death, as well as economic decline, flooding, increasing heats, exactly because we have disrupted the natural system and pulled at the thread of our own human habitat. So if we care about healthy cities and we want to deliver on the NPPF's ambitions for healthy streets, we should care about walkable places. Walking and wheeling is the most democratic form of transport. Every journey starts and ends with it. It's free, it's social, and it's good for public health. But people don't walk simply because you've delivered the legally required pavement. They walk where streets are interesting, comfortable, shaded, and sociable. So trees really are one of the most powerful ways to make walkable places and make walking and wheeling feel natural, because they provide shade, they provide enclosure, they provide rhythm, visual interest, pause as a meeting place, and we'll come on to this some more. So if we're going to be system thinkers and succeed in the built environment system, delivering human habitat, we must be clear on the power trees have to benefit multiple urban systems simultaneously. And the built environment profession or system, though, is a wonderful thing and wonderful at working in silos and blinkering itself to the system continuing next door: transport, climate, health, ecology, economy. But we know cities don't work in silos, and we do not experience places in silos. And to be successful, we cannot work in silos. So the urban tree is the veritable stick to beat the silos with, because trees operate across systems. One intervention that produces multiple outcomes at once for transport, public health, social life, climate, the economy, biodiversity, and play. So if we're thinking about the system and beyond all the environmental, the ecological, and habitat needs for trees, which you guys can cover, I also wanted to set out some urban design reasons for trees. And trees, firstly, they slow traffic, and without signs, drivers instinctively slow in enclosed spaces, and trees create visual friction and perceived narrowness, reducing vehicle speeds without enforcement. Trees make walking distances feel shorter because shaded, visually interesting streets reduce perceived distance, so we're willing to walk further when routes are green. Trees make streets more legible. A row, a cluster, a landmark tree becomes urban punctuation, marking crossings, marking corners, creating squares of trees. This gives a neighborhood identity. Trees clearly create a microclimate. They can reduce surface temperatures dramatically and make streets walkable in hot weather, extending usable public space for more of the year, with all the myriad connected benefits that unlocks. Trees create invitations to linger. People stop where there is shade, shelter, and softness. Trees convert corridors of movement into places of pause and accidental meeting places. A bench under a tree becomes an informal social node, one of the smallest units of urban democracy. Trees soften the psychological hardness of cities. Stone, asphalt, and glass are visually aggressive elements. Trees provide relief, texture, and seasonal change. Trees make streets safer for children. Lower vehicle speeds, shade, climbable elements. These all encourage play and independent mobility, again, with all the huge connected benefits that unlocks. Trees also structure space without walls. A tree can define edges and create urban rooms, can define thresholds, and again, all without barriers. They are the lightest possible urban architecture. And trees absorb noise and visual stress. Even modest planting reduces perceived noise and improves the experience of busy streets, which is absolutely critical to people with sensory impairments, and of course beneficial to all. And trees signal care and stewardship. A planted street tells people this place matters, and neglected streets and neighborhoods, rarely have healthy trees. And trees make places really memorable. Who couldn't tell me which country this is in? And I think super important, like, trees democratize comfort. Shade and shelter here is free infrastructure, and it benefits everyone, not only those who can afford private gardens or air conditioning. And we've written so much about how trees can support public health. Tree-lined streets are associated with lower stress, better mental health, and increased physical activity, again, with all the huge connected benefits that this brings. And trees create seasonal theatre, blossom, colour change, leaf fall. Trees bring time and rhythm into the city. And trees also invite curiosity and play. Children climb them, people touch them, people sit beneath them, we photograph them. Trees are interactive urban infrastructure. And trees support small economies. Cafes, markets, street vendors, these all thrive when people are comfortable staying outdoors. The local word for a quick drink in Venice is an ombra, and that translates from the historical practice of wine vendors in St. Mark's Square, moving their stalls to stay in the shadow, translation being ombra, of the Campanile bell tower to keep the wine cool. So do we need any more evidence than that? So to wrap up, if trees are urban infrastructure, the question becomes, how do we design streets so trees can succeed? And well, we first need to plant trees where people are, not just where space remains. Trees should reinforce human activity. So think about how we can plant trees at crossings, at bus stops, outside shops, and in and around play spaces. And we really need to always use trees to structure movement along streets and in public spaces. Trees can signal a crossing, a junction, narrowing points, and entrances to neighborhoods. So really start to use them as a wayfinding device, rather than just thinking about how we can create lines of trees. Because that's really important. We need to think about trees in clusters, not just lines. Because street trees shouldn't always be in rows, right? Clusters create social spaces. They form mini squares. They can frame seating and even define parking bays and break up sort of monotony of parking bays in high streets and residential streets. We also must design soil before species. Tree success is often invisible infrastructure. Successful streets have to prioritize soil volume and water, root space, and of course, long-term maintenance. And finally, allow trees to be part of urban life and avoid over-control. Trees should really allow climbing, allow people to sit under them in a shady spot, play around them, and use them informally. Cities are and should be slightly messy, and trees thrive as part of life and lived in streets, not sterile ones. So when we talk about streets, we often talk about carbon, biodiversity, and environmental mitigation. These things are very important and they obviously matter. But the deeper reason cities need trees, I think, is more simple. Trees make streets human. They slow us down, they invite us to linger, they create shade, they structure space, and make the everyday act of walking through the city feel like something worth doing. So a street tree is not decoration. It's one of the smallest and most powerful pieces of urban infrastructure we have, which quietly shapes how fast we drive, how far we walk, how long we stay, and whether we meet each other at all. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. I mean, some great visuals there that really demonstrate the impact that trees really have on, the environment. Sue, is there any questions for Chris right now?
I'm so busy trying to write things. I think that there's been a lot of discussion about using this word infrastructure and so on, because Naomi is very keen to say that trees are natural elements. But the reason that we've even called this series of seminars Trees as Critical Infrastructure is it's a matter of using language that will persuade all sorts of people who haven't put trees as high on the agenda as we would all like them to sort of sit up and think a bit, because you're talking about infrastructure, you're talking about being part of a system. I mean, how do you see it, Chris? I think it's sort of, we have to use a language that resonates with people who we want to impress.
I mean, language is so split this into two things. We talk about blue-green infrastructure, and we talk about, I think, while something is natural, it doesn't mean it can't be part of an infrastructure system. I think thinking about things as infrastructure means thinking about things as networks rather than in isolation, and that's really important. And thinking about things in that way means we can think about them at a larger scale. Then the semantics of using words like infrastructure is massive as well, as you say, Sue, in terms of getting people to actually sit up and think that this isn't decoration, and that's kind of the point I wanted to make. It's not something that can be dismissed. It's critical infrastructure, and I think using that language and how we talk about trees is really important. And you can have natural infrastructure. That's no problem.
Naomi isn't going to let us get away with it. Come on, Naomi, tell us what you think.
No, I certainly won't, because the term infrastructure has baggage, and you cannot make the baggage go away. And so infrastructure is defined as human construct. Trees were not constructed by us. They precede us. All the trees we plant in our urban environment come from a forest somewhere in the world. They never forget those genetics. And if we are going to encourage people to respect trees and their right to life, one has to use language that supports the fact that they are living. They're not jewelry. They're not an amenity. Yes, they provide ecosystem services, but only if you give them what they need and what they have the right to expect. And so, this term green infrastructure, if you come back to its origin and when it was first used, it's part of the U.S. Clean Water Act in 1972, and it was defined as The range of measures that use plant or soil systems, permeable pavement or other permeable surfaces or substrates, stormwater harvest and reuse, or landscaping to store, infiltrate, or evapotranspirate stormwater and reduce flows to sewer systems or to surface waters. Human construct. And so I would ask that this term and its baggage, that we mitigate its usage by remembering that we're dealing with a living organism that needs to be valued for the fact it is alive. And I'll leave it there.
If I can just come back quickly, I think you know I don't think anyone's going to disagree with your points being made. I think if we do take a look at the definition of infrastructure, it potentially opens up some interesting elements, because it's the basic systems and services that a country uses in order to work effectively. I would argue that trees need to fit heavily in that category. It's something that is actually essential for effective operation in the world. So I think maybe we're just both disagreeing well, but I think it's definitely something in it, especially that unlocks the delivery of more.
That's why we're sticking with it. It tells a language. I know I was talking to somebody who's very distinguished academic, and she said she was going to be a green infrastructure engineer, because by using the word engineer, she made people listen to her more than if she sort of just was a designer or something. It sort of resonated. So whatever makes things resonate, I'll go with. There we are. I should stop. We should stop.
Thank you. Thanks, Chris, and thank you, Naomi, for your contributions as well. So our final presenter is Poppy George. She's a tree planting programme officer at the London Borough of Lambeth, who raised the interesting question of how to achieve success with trees in open urban landscapes. Over to you, Poppy.
Thanks, Saira. So, hi everyone, I'm Poppy. I'm from the London Borough of Lambeth. I'm the tree planting officer here, and I have been managing the programme for about 2.5 years. Let me just get my presentation up and do it from the beginning. Can everyone see? Can you see that?
Yes, we can.
Oh, good. So I've been in this role for 2.5 years, and I actually sidestepped into tree planting from community food growing and sort of working with communities and schools to do urban greening and grow food. I work in the borough that I live in, which I think has been hugely helpful. And as part of this role, I had to start plotting and planting, with contractors at first, planting in the open green spaces within the borough. And I'm not a landscape designer. I love trees. I love being in nature. I like looking at nature, but it was actually quite a big challenge. And also, here we go. Why am I doing the presentation? It's a huge privilege to be able to affect these areas and plant trees and try and work out what would be best in them, but it's also an enormous responsibility. And I have to say, because I live in my borough, and I probably will do for the rest of my life, I was like, God, I hope I'm making some good choices here. They might come back to haunt me in later life. But also I was very much thought about the fact that I was really influencing the flavour and the feel and the look of these spaces, that future generations, that will affect how they experience being in different parks and open spaces. And so this is why I wrote into Sue, because I actually was hoping someone else was going to do this presentation on successful planting in urban green spaces, because I wanted to learn about it. So Sue asked me if I would do it, and I said yes. And what I did is I contacted some colleagues in the London Tree Officers Association planting working group, and I've interviewed around 5 people who also plant in urban green spaces. Really just had conversations with them to see what processes they go through when they have this responsibility, and that they need to do for work. When I first started walking around parks, I did notice, you might see in this picture here on the right, it's probably not that clear because newly planted trees are quite hard to see in photos, to be fair. But on the left here, we've got this big willow, there's a big pine in the background. And I noticed some planting where there'd sort of been some plonking done. There's definitely the big possibility for plonking when planting trees. So people just kind of go, yeah, we'll put 5 trees there, we'll put these 3 in a row, and we'll put 2 more in front, without you feel looking at the bigger picture of the space, what other trees are there, what is the narrative that's happening in that space. And it made me think, so why is this kind of happening, this plonking? Because it's probably not going to look that good in the future, and it's probably not going to work that well with the existing trees. And those sorts of questions were going through my mind. I think some of the reasons why this kind of happens is often previously, I think tree planting officers is quite a novel role. And before then, often it was the tree officers who would be planting a lot of these trees or choosing the locations and the species. And they have got loads of other work to do. So they're very under-resourced to be like creative and be landscape architects. Our borough does not have an in-house landscape architect. So there's nobody who I can go to for advice within the council about this question. I think also there's often really large planting targets at the moment. So there's definitely pressure on, just like get that tree in. And also I would say that nowadays a lot of orders and a lot of plotting is all done on tablets, using kind of tree asset databases, which you often then issue your orders to the contractor through tablets. So they'll see it on a GPS, like on a map. But unless you go out on site with your contractor and you make sure where they're planting it, that GPS and how close things are plotted together, unless it's really monitored, there can be a bit of a disconnect there, I think, from my experience. Next slide. So just looking at the overview of public spaces, what really I'm looking at, what all the elements that need to be considered to try and create successful planting in public open spaces. And a lot of you probably know all this already, but hey. So yeah, and a lot of our open spaces, they're really contested spaces. There's sports activities, there's sometimes festival and events, you've got dog walkers, you've got play space for children and adults, sunbathers. A lot of our urban environments in Lambeth, for example, over 70% of Lambeth residents live in flats, and apartments. So open spaces are really important for people getting the sun rays. You might have protected views within parks, and also people just use them for recreation and nature connection. So you've got all these different contesting sort of elements of how space is used by the public and what it means to them. So when I interviewed the different planting officers, I've obviously got my own method, how I've been working. And I think when I started having to plot these trees, I was very much about observing the space. And because I live in the borough, I'm quite open to talking to quite a lot of members of the public, and seeing, how they feel about the space, what do they think about it. but I asked the other tree planting officers. So I think the first question is why? Why is this planting going to happen in this space? Because this really informs your decisions as to what kind of planting is going to occur and what choices you're going to make as a planting officer. Often it's, there's a huge drive to increase canopy cover at the moment. We're thinking about successional planting. Good to think about, are we thinking about formal planting? Is this park somewhere that the planting's quite formal and that's what the public expect? Or are you trying to create a more naturalized woodland feeling, sort of creating new spaces for walkers? There's definitely an element of strengthening the boundaries around open spaces and the edges. I would say in Lambeth, even partly to do with stopping people having parties, like driving on sound systems into parks. We're like, let's fill up the edge so people can't just drive into the park, which I think things like that are happening a bit more often. You might want to plant orchards, growing community food. There might be a cultural significance reason why this planting wants to happen. Maybe someone wants a memorial or in relation to a particular group of people or, something like that. It's really about placemaking, and who is that placemaking for is the question. I think also planting targets, a lot of planting officers, we will have planting targets. And so there's an expectation you're going to plant a certain number of trees every winter, for example. And that does influence how many trees you're going to plant, etc. Right. Yeah. So when I ask people about their processes, one of the first things that most of the planting officers considered was the history of the site and existing tree considerations. So they'd look at the historical context of the site. A lot of tree officers talks about place names that might be like impart some information about the history of the site, and also say somewhere's called Elms Park, you might want to think about planting elms there. Also the cultural significance of different places. For example, Ruskin Park is where John Ruskin lived and wrote loads of poetry and stuff. So we're considering that connection when planting trees. The local knowledge of the site was really important. One tree officer said by talking to locals and also looking up the history of a site, you might find out that the usage had changed at some point. One of the sites, she had planted loads of cherry trees, which was for a special Japanese kind of cultural planting. And found that loads of them failed, and then they realized that actually there'd been a pond there originally, and all these cherries were sitting in lots of water. So looking at that historical element of these open spaces will definitely influence your site. I would say also a lot of Lambeth open spaces, the smaller ones, are actually created on old roads. They're old bomb sites. So actually under the park, you will have an old road running under the park. So you wouldn't want to plant trees there because they're not going to establish very well. So yeah, having an understanding of the history of your site is really important. And also, I would say the community's perception of that place, and the kind of historical, like the perception of it, that you will have some people who live there who their families have been living there for generations. So they will, it's good to bring in their perspective and their memories to help you create a narrative that sort of continues. It's not like a narrative that's completely different, because I think for residents and community members, a continuum, some sort of continuum of narrative is very reassuring, really. Often these spaces are really important to people. So another element of successful planting in community open spaces that are used by residents and the community is collaboration and / consultation. So often you would consult. I think in local authorities the word consultation is not particularly popular with the public, to be honest, because it often implies that you will ask them a question and maybe just do what you want anyway. But I think also it's an element of collaboration. I think some of the best ideas come out of collaboration. That is my experience. Whether that's fellow tree officers, friends of groups, or other users of the park, including other people's ideas and having conversations with people can bring out really good results that tick more people's boxes, really. And maybe you create something that's a bit more exciting, I would say. I very much, when I'm doing the open spaces in parks, I really connect with friends of groups and maybe do a few walkarounds with them that might last, a good hour or two, looking at the site, looking at different spaces, thinking about what we do and how it's going to affect the feel of the park and what we're trying to create together. And it's actually a really nice process. Informal conversations are really useful, just talking to random people walking by about your plans and seeing how they respond. However, the amount of time you have to put into all these conversations and collaborations definitely depends on officer resource time. How much time do you have to bring members of the public into this conversation, or just other colleagues? There's always that dynamic that can make it quite tricky, I would say. But definitely, so other officers said that, other people I interviewed said that obviously a lot of it depends on if you're working with people who are really committed to those trees and they're going to either water them or they're going to monitor them if you have contractors watering your trees. They're going to monitor those trees. They're going to notice if that tree's got damage. They're going to notice if the tie is loose, if the contractor hasn't watered them. Then it's really important to build those relationships because it's important for the trees and for their success within that landscape. I think also by collaborating, it's nice sharing that creative opportunity. Other people are very, very keen to get involved in it. So the next slide. So talking to the other planting officers about how they begin the process. What do you need to think about to ensure successful planting? Surveying the site is essential. Looking at the existing canopy coverage. How large is it? Also, how long is it likely to last? I would say, what does the existing what narrative does the existing canopy cover tell, along with the shrub layer and the meadow level? So that's like looking at the open space as a whole. And I think also you'll find in some parks it's much more formal, the narrative, whereas in some other spaces, even within the same park, you might have a more formal area and then you'll have a wilder area. And it's like, how do you build on those themes, really? Also looking at the spaces in between trees. One tree officer said to me, it's about looking at the spaces in between the trees. And you don't want to fill all of those spaces. The space is really important. And I've noticed when looking at sort of Victorian planting, there's definitely like a rhythm between the trees planted, and sort of really thinking about that rhythm and how it feels is kind of important. I've seen a lot of more recent planting where trees are planted much closer together and that sense of rhythm is kind of lost. Things are kind of clustered together and a bit squashed. Other aspects to consider that I've come across, although you tend to get a lot of avenue planting, in some of our parks and open spaces, our parks development officers are not happy with trees next to paths because they said that they have residents who complain they make them feel quite unsafe because of sight lines, especially near wooded areas. So we've had to take that into consideration. One of the people I interviewed, she goes out with a soil auger. She's the only person. She goes out with a soil auger and she checks the soil to ensure for species selection, which I think is really important. Also, just like, as I said, a lot of parks under the ground, you often don't know what's there. And also, how's the space used, which I've covered already. So other practical considerations that we think about. These are really basic ones, but always look up when you're going to plot a tree, because you don't want to plot a tree under existing canopy cover, which happens quite a lot. You'd be surprised how often a tree gets plotted underneath another tree. So always look up. When I'm doing community planting with people, I always get them to look up, because often when we're planting, and to remind the contractors to look up as well, actually, because often when we're planting trees, we're just like focused on the ground and looking down. But it's really important you look up and you look around to see how the place where you've chosen, how does that fit with everything else in this open space? A lot of people plant trees too close together nowadays, I've noticed. So really important to give trees space in open spaces. You can't rely on a contractor to interpret your order. I think this is especially over when it's done over tablets, which a lot of it is done nowadays. You can't expect them to make your common sense adjustments for you, because that's not really their job. So in fact, last year, I think I planted over 700 trees in open spaces in estates, and I actually went out and marked all of those locations, either the morning my contractor got on site or the night before, because from the season before, I'd noticed that if you leave it to the contractor, even like 50 centimeters can make quite a difference to whether a tree is in a good location or a bad location, in my opinion. Also, other practical considerations to make: how's the tree going to be watered? Is it accessible for contractors in a vehicle? A lot of trees are watered by contractors in a vehicle. Or if it's watered by members of a friends group, is that tree accessible? Is it near water? Is it going to be a tree? If they're going to water it, how are they going to water it? Is it close to their water source? Another interesting point that one of the interviewees says was never make a tree a point of conflict. For example, some people, parks development officers, might say, let's plant a tree in the middle of this desire line so that we can stop people cutting across this part of the park. But actually, the tree's never really going to survive there. It's not a good location for a tree. That is not the tree's job to kind of resolve that conflict. And I did plant a tree near a desire line, and it didn't do very well at all. It was an oak, and it was way too compacted. The ground was really compacted, so I learnt that way. Another element that we get a lot of when we're planting in parks, especially with community members, is the conversation around biodiversity, but then we also have climate resilience. And from my observations, a lot of community members are more focused on biodiversity, and tree officers tend to be focused on climate resilience. Obviously, it's a huge conversation at the moment, and there's enormous amounts of learning to do, which I'm trying, and along with my job. But I think it's important talking to other people. We don't really know how those climate models are going to play out. So diversity at the moment is key. And I think this covers both areas. So in terms of planting native for biodiversity, but also planting non-native species, so that we're kind of covering both bases really in this. We're in a transitionary point and we don't really know which way it's going to go. So cover all bases seemed to be the general mood I got from everybody. Also being aware of known existing biodiversity within a space, particular species other than trees. So being aware of those, there might be a biodiversity officer in your local council, and then when you're planting, thinking, okay, I'm going to increase this habitat. For example, we have the white-letter hair-streaked butterfly. It lives on elms, is one of its habitats. And it's been sighted in Vauxhall Pleasure Gardens in Vauxhall, where there were some elms planted about 10 years ago. So we're currently trying to remember that and plant elms on estates and open spaces nearby to increase its habitat. And then this was the other question I asked the tree officers, because I find with tree officers there's a lot of, it's very technical, a lot of right brain thinking. But I found when I went out into parks to plot, I was like doing a lot of left brain thinking and being kind of quite creative and like, oh, what's going on here? So I asked them all that question. Had some nice answers. On the right here, this is Millfields Park, which is in Hackney, next to Hackney Marshes. And these kind of circles you can see here, which you can't see that well. I've not been to visit it yet. I will do. These are like biomes. One's North American, one's West Asian, East Asian. There's an oak woodlands and an European alpine biome. So the council had some funding. This was from Marcello at the Tree Musketeers at the Hackney Tree Nursery. The council, and he was working in Hackney at the time, I think, the council had some funding to plant trees, and instead of planting 8 standards, instead they created these biomes with larger and smaller trees, and create something really interesting. And also they're very innovative, experimental, and really interesting, creating something that's really interesting. And it will be good to see how those different spaces develop as well in terms of climate resilience. So he very much was, necessity is the mother of invention. They had this funding. They had some small trees, I think, in Hackney Community Tree Nursery. So this kind of idea evolved with other tree officers. So I thought that was really cool. Also, he was talking about using more quirky stock as opposed to strict standards. When you start using trees that are maybe grown by community tree nurseries, they are more creative shapes, which maybe make you feel a bit more creative. Being innovative, planning and planting for the future was one theme. And I think also just allowing time to observe spaces and sense spaces, and allow for it to be a creative process, plotting and planting trees, as opposed to a purely technical job you have to get done, is really important. One person said she has no time for left brain thinking because she's just focused on getting trees to maturity, which I really respected. And obviously there's inspiration from other planting schemes and designs. So penultimate slide. I thought I'd include one in community planting. The trees on the right, these are some trees that were planted really as whips by the Friends of Norwood Park, and they're now getting to quite a good size. In the summer, it's ever so pleasant in there. I took this photo this morning. Actually, quite a lot of birds in there. I noticed loads of birds in this little area. They were loving it. And I think planting with community groups, planting smaller trees, they do take longer to reach maturity, but they often catch up planting smaller trees rather than standards. But it's cheap, it's cheaper, it's easier, it's a great way of creating woodlands. You can plant more quirky stock. and really satisfying for those people who planted it. I think these are 7 years old now. So walking around with them last year, they were so delighted with this space, and you could see it had been a really great thing to be part of for members of the public. And I think there was really good high biodiversity value there. So my final tips were that I'd put in at the end was always observe your spaces, and the aim is not to fill in the gaps. Plant species individually or in groups of 3, 5, and 7s. That's what everybody tells you. That's like the thing that all tree planting officers say, oh yeah, plant it in groups of 3, 5s, and 7s. Don't be afraid to take risks. Now's the time to take risks, seem to be the general feel. Planting new species or creating a new sense of place. I think it's important to enjoy the process and give it the time it really deserves, and allow room for creativity. I know I haven't included much in here about species selection. Let me close this and come back here. I haven't allowed much time for species selection, but listening to the previous slides, I would say that a lot of people on the ground, tree planting officers, are being really very experimental about different species, look for climate resilience and climate change. And I would say groups like the tree planting working group with the London Tree Officers Association is a great community of practice, and those kind of groups are really important for people on the ground like me to make informed decisions that hopefully will lead to an increased canopy cover and more trees surviving into the future for our open spaces. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Poppy. And I know having a dedicated woodland creation officer and, you know, having a tree planting program officers makes a massive difference, especially when you're working with landscape architects in identifying the right places, the right trees, but also that community engagement, identifying sites across different areas, private, public land. It's a perfect way to work, really. And, I benefit from that in Bradford, and it means that we're able to do a lot more. Thank you very much for that. If I can ask all the presenters to put their cameras on, and there's an opportunity here for the audience to ask any questions or make any comments. If you want to raise your hand, if you want to speak. Otherwise, Sue, if there are any questions that
I picked up a few things. So one of the things that have been raised quite a lot through the chat is this problem that the design team that's pulled together at the initial stages doesn't actually follow through to delivery on site, and so a lot gets lost in translation. So how do we overcome that? I mean, does it become a sort of mandatory planning requirement that somebody sees it through? What's the process that could actually stop the arboriculturists, the landscape architects, so many of those key people for delivering of the spaces between buildings, being engaged in that process to the very end? Who's going to tackle that one? It's the difficult question. Harry?
There are a couple of ways of dealing with this, and your instinct is to think like, how can we do this in a way that is relatively light touch in terms of planning requirements? We don't want to be introducing new legislation. Do need to think about it from a contracts point of view. And I think ultimately what we really need to think about it from is the perspective of the person or the organisation that's commissioning the work. Because ultimately they're the people who are going to be issuing the contract. So the thought I've been wondering about for a while is, could we deal with this from the perspective of planning conditions? Could we use some of the tools that we've got within the local authority world to affect this? Because if you think about what a planning condition can do, it doesn't slow development down in terms of permitting development. That's already been dealt with at the application stage. But what it could do is it could require pieces of work to be carried out and specify the standards which is carried out that might be qualitatively different. And I'm thinking here of fields which aren't addressed at the moment through the normal conditions, thinking of things like biosecurity, if we were to introduce a biosecurity requirement in the planning conditions for something like a biosecurity management plan, such as the same way you have a landscape management plan, that would require a skill set that requires arboriculturists, urban foresters, landscape architects, and so on, to come together and contribute to something which is holistic and means that all the people have got to be around the table at the same time. That might be quite an interesting way of approaching this, and it wouldn't necessarily need to introduce burdensome costs to the program. The other thing is probably less palatable. It's to do with enforcement. Like, there is a lot of legislation that already exists. There's a lot of tools that could be used, and it's difficult because it's expensive enforcement, and no one wants to do it unless you absolutely need to. But sometimes you do need to do it. So I wonder what we could do for local authorities to use that perhaps as a tool more often if need be.
Give them some money. So would your biosecurity have a sort of biosecurity sign-off, which meant that everybody engaged at the outset had to be there at the end in order to say, yeah, you've done it. We've done it.
That'd be really interesting. Yeah, because biosecurity is a field that requires lots of people to come together, to work together. It requires ecologists, arboriculturists, landscape architects, and so on to come together. That might be quite an interesting field to explore there.
Thanks. Sarah, I see that Liam and Mark had their hands up. Was it Liam first?
Yeah, hi. Well, as a planning officer, maybe I should come in on this one. Yeah, so it would be very simple to get evidence of a plant passport without making it onerous for applicants, agents, and developers in terms of the biosecurity. In terms of monitoring, BS 5837 is very keyed to that being the remit of the local planning authority. From my perspective, and what hasn't been measured is something which is design coding and best practice, and providing that instead is probably the best way forward in terms of reachable soil volumes, installation where needed of soil cells as well, and just starting to develop something which would be acceptable across most urban environments, I think is the way forward. So more guidance, and at an earlier stage. REBA stage 1, please.
Thank you, Liam. I think, Mark, did you have a point?
Yeah, just from a planning perspective, echoing Liam's sentiment, then yes, obviously the consultation design guidance that's just closed was the space to put that in. But from a drainage perspective, flood perspective, then obviously the BNG shortfall and attenuating tree pits still sit very beautifully in that space, and we're getting nothing from designer's own volition coming through. So we're having to educate them one planning application at a time. So something to bring that forward would be a great assistance.
Thank you. So are there any other hands up? I've seemed to have lost.
I think Naomi's got her hand up.
Yes, thank you. So, Harry, just to continue this. It's okay. To continue
I just
this
muted
dialogue. So, has anyone considered looking at what other countries might be doing to ensure greater protection and conservation? So, for example, I'm retired now. I'm still kind of working, but my practice was in New York City. And I was on both the design and the build teams. And on the design, I, as a consulting arborist, but actually an urban forester, wrote all the specifications that dealt with treed landscape protection. And on the build, I was on site every day on these large public infrastructure projects, doing implementation and enforcement. And in my experience, if you don't have somebody there, and I see it in Switzerland, they make these calls telling the foreman, you're not doing this protection, you're not doing that protection, but in the field, it's not implemented. And so I can pass by day after day, and the protection fence is still not up, and the construction equipment is still being stored against the tree, on open landscape, on the tree's roots, damaging the tree. And so if the detailed specifications are not realized in the actual daily project thought process, this doesn't happen. And so it's just, and in terms of cost, if the thinking is strictly short term, we always lose. But the thinking has to become outcome based budgeting, long term thinking, so that it's understood that trees are an appreciating asset and natural capital asset is the thought process based on outcome budgeting. And if that's not injected, we always lose. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Noah. Poppy, did you want to come in?
Yeah, I was just going to support that really, like, because I also manage the street tree planting in Lambeth and have done quite a lot of highways planting, which are part of SUD schemes or transport schemes. And often the designers on those schemes, they're great, but they don't really know anything about plants or trees. We don't have a landscape architect. Everything's being specified from outside the council in general, but actually it was really useful, I think, that I was willing to go onto site quite regularly and make sure they're constructing the pits correctly. You know, the contractor, who are not ARB contractors, they're not tree planting contractors, they're like a big engineering contractor. And I think it's kind of essential and should be paid out of, you know, Section 106 or wherever the money's coming from. They should be putting money aside for people who know about plants and greening to have some oversight, because if you don't have that person, no, everybody else is like, well, I don't actually know anything about plants or trees, but I've done this wonderful, you know, and so you lose the vital element. The final element is the part that gets overlooked the most, I think.
Can I put up a little plea for the clerk of works? I think it goes back to getting absolutely the right specification. And then, as with buildings, we want clerk of works there. You know, they're vital. Shouldn't we always have a landscape or arboricultural clerk of works as a requirement on a development site?
But I think also every local authority should have landscape architects. I mean, you know, in this day and age, the fact that, you know, I'm so surprised. I still get surprised when I hear that there are local authorities that don't have landscape architects. Incredible. Thank you. I think I'm just having a look, see if there's other. Delga?
Yep.
Yep. Sorry if I pronounced that wrong.
No, you got it right. It's all right. I've got two observations. One is that where I work normally in the Northwest, I work a lot in the Liverpool City region. And one of the conditions of planning consent is always the appointment of an arboricultural clerk of works to overlook A, the protection measures, and B, when tree planting is happening, they've got to sign it off. So that's a step forward. I got a question for Poppy, though. It's this, because it came up of a recent case I was involved in, when she's planting trees, and specifically highway trees, do they take account of the fact that Lambeth is on London clay? Okay.
Yeah.
And then you have a subsidence issue in the future, possibly. Is that taken into account?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Yes, we take it into account. So we're kind of aware of all our subsidence streets. So, for example, I have got some sponsored trees on subsidence trees this winter. So I've got to really carefully choose those species that are things that aren't going to grow very big and are low water demand. So we have a list at the moment.
Sorry, can I interrupt you there?
Yeah.
There's no such thing as water demand. Water demand can't be measured. It's a non-term. And I've got a letter from Giles Biddle who coined the phrase to show that he thinks it's not a phrase that should be used. That's point number one. Point number two is a lot of trees are scheduled as not causing subsidence, and that is simply because they haven't been planted enough. You know,
Yeah.
there are 10 species. The research has shown that if you grow any of those 10 species on shrinkable clay soil within 10 meters of the structure, you're going to have subsidence at some stage in the future. So in species selection, I think, whereas I admire what you're doing and I love the approach you're taking, the point is we don't know what species could cause subsidence in the future. And the only clue I can give you is look at the rooting habit of the tree.
Yeah.
If it's a shallow rooting tree, very little subsidence. If it's a deep rooting tree, you're going to have a subsidence problem.
Yeah. Well, I defer to the tree officers for the different areas in Lambeth. I'm the tree planting officer, but I always defer to the head of the tree service and tree officers when planting in subsidence areas, because obviously it is a big decision to make what species should go in there. Generally, we're just planting small trees so that the amount of water that they are going to need will be less than a tree that grows very large. I think also everyone's quite nervous because if we do get these very hot summers, then we're going to have a lot more clay shrinkage.
Yep.
And which means a lot more trees are going to get blamed for that. A lot more trees will be felled because of subsidence claims. And cities will get even hotter and the clay will shrink even more. So it's a bit of a conundrum, actually, that, I think.
It is, but there is a way of doing it. And I think with modern planting techniques, if you use, I've got no connection with them, if you use the green-blue urban approach where you do containerize the trees effectively in streets, you make it such that the roots have no reason to travel outside the planting pit. And an awful lot can be put into designing the tree planting to better accommodate this. Okay, I'll shut up now. Thanks for your help.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, everything's bang on time so far. So I think want to just ask the speakers if they've got any final reflections or thoughts. Harry, shall we start with you? Oh, no.
Only to say thank you for having us. It's been an interesting session.
Thank you. Poppy, did you want to come in?
I don't know. Has Liam Bullam already asked something? Someone's got their hand up there. It says on my screen.
Yeah, Liam's got his hand up.
Liam came in earlier. Yeah, he just forgot to put his hand down, I think.
Oh, he just hasn't put his hand down. That's what it is. I was going to say thanks for having me. Yeah, thanks.
I did have a question previously sent to the panel. What I did was answer a question from a planning perspective, which seemed to involve planning. But what it really is, and when we're considering above ground considerations, which this session is guided on, is on spatial awareness and spatial guidance on the room required for existing trees, so avoidance from balconies, for example, on balconies, and a preference to inset balconies. What the question was about was, should there be further spatial guidance provided in design coding, which would allow for better consideration of mature tree canopies? Thank you.
From a lighting perspective, I'd say yes, please, to that. Yeah, a lot more consideration for how big a tree grows would certainly be useful, and and more information around that from a lighting perspective. We very rarely get an accurate prediction of what canopy size a tree will have. It's often an indicative tree early doors, and then we don't get any further information on that, which is no wonder we end up with trees in or lighting in trees.
Yeah, I have seen a kind of a weird calculation on working out dappled shade.
I mean, from a landscape architect's perspective, it is about having the right tree in the right places, and we give a lot of thought to the surrounding area and how it's going to look in 5 years' time, how it's going to look in 20 years' time, because we want our trees to last. So it is very much about putting the right tree in the right place and the right species as well. So, well, on that, thank you. I just want to thank all our speakers for such a thoughtful contributions. And what today's discussion has shown is that designing successfully with trees really requires multiple perspectives working together. And taking together these insights really reinforce that if we want trees to thrive, they need to be considered from the outset through design, delivery, and long-term stewardship. Because when we create the right conditions for the trees, they can truly function as part of the critical infrastructure of our cities. Thank you, everybody, for being part of this conversation today. And just a reminder that the next seminar on the 22nd of April will be same time, part 2 of this discussion on underground challenges. Thank you very much. I'll just hand over to Sue now to wrap up.
Okay, so thank you, Sarah, very mumuch for your excellent sharing. Thank you for everybody who's attended. And I shall look at all the chat. There is so much of it. I'll try and make sense of it, and it will go onto the Trees Design Action Group website. And I think some questions have been raised by people that we need to reflect on, because I think that I see the source of further discussions are needed. So I will formally close the meeting. I'll stay online for a bit longer in case anybody has something they'd like